They say grief changes you. What they don't tell you is that sometimes it strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself, leaving you raw and hungry for truths you never wanted to discover. I was 26 when I first walked through those wrought iron gates, my morning dress catching on the thorns of overgrown roses that nobody had bothered to tend. The Valescu mansion loomed before me like something from a Gothic novel, all sharp angles and dark windows that seemed to watch. Dominic had insisted I stay here after Marcus's funeral, claimed it was what his son would have wanted. But standing in that grand foyer, surrounded by oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, I felt like prey walking into a predator's den. Dominic Valescu was nothing like his son. Where Marcus had been gentle, refined, almost fragile in his kindness, his father was all sharp edges and dangerous smiles. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, and the darkness of someone who had taken what he wanted anyway. His hair was silver at the temples, his eyes the color of storm clouds, and when he looked at me, I felt exposed in a way that made my skin burn. "Welcome home, Elena," he'd said that first night, his voice like aged whiskey. The way he said my name made something twist in my stomach, something that felt dangerously close to want. But I was a widow. I was his daughter-in-law. I was supposed to be grieving. The rules were simple enough. Don't enter the West Wing. It's being renovated. Don't ask about his past, some wounds never heal. And never stay after dark in his study. He works late and doesn't like to be disturbed. I followed them for exactly 3 days. Grief makes you reckless. It makes you push boundaries you never would have crossed before, makes you hungry for feeling when numbness becomes unbearable. On the 4th night, I found myself standing before the forbidden door of the West Wing, my hand trembling on the brass handle. The hallway beyond was pristine, not a speck of dust in sight. No renovation, no workers' tools, no signs of construction. Just portrait after portrait, lining the walls, women in various stages of undress, all with the same haunting beauty, all with the same dark eyes. My heart stopped when I reached the end of the hall. There, in a place of honor, hung a painting that made my blood run cold. It was me or someone who looked exactly like me, but the clothing was wrong, the hairstyle decades out of place. The nameplate read, Isabella Valescu, 1923–1925. Isabella died in childbirth, a voice said behind me. I spun around to find Dominic leaning against the doorframe, his tie loosened, his shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the hollow of his throat. She was my grandfather's second wife. Beautiful, wasn't she? I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The resemblance was impossible, uncanny. Maria came next, he continued, gesturing to another portrait. 1943, then Catherine in 1967. Sophia in 1989. His eyes never left mine as he moved closer, each step deliberate and predatory. They all had your eyes, Elena, your mouth, your ... spirit. That's impossible, I whispered. Is it? He was close enough now that I could smell his cologne, feel the heat radiating from his body. Or did you think it was coincidence that my son found you at that art gallery? But he was so immediately ... captivated? The truth hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't fallen in love with me by chance. He'd been sent to find me, to bring me here, to add me to this collection of women who all bore the same face. That's when I understood, I would tell myself. Later, when I was alone in my room, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I wasn't the first widow he'd taken in, but in that moment, with Dominic's hand suddenly gripping my wrist, spinning me around until my back was pressed against the wall, I understood something else entirely. The way his thumb found my pulse, the way his breath was hot against my neck, the way his eyes had darkened with something primal and hungry. Curiosity killed the cat, Elena, he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. But satisfaction? His thumb brushed over my racing pulse. That brought it back. My lips parted, whether to speak or scream, I'll never know. Because in that moment, with his body caging me against the wall and his eyes promising things I didn't dare name, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Marcus died. I felt alive. I fled. Ran like a coward back to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told myself I hated him. Told myself he was sick, twisted, dangerous. So why did I dream of his hands that night? Why did I wake up gasping, my skin damp with sweat and need? For 3 days I avoided him. I took my meals in my room, spent my time in the gardens, anywhere but in the main house where I might encounter those storm-gray eyes, but the mansion felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in, and I found myself drawn to the library, the one room where I'd never seen him. I should have known better. The storm that night was vicious, rain lashing against the windows with a fury that matched the tempest in my chest. I'd been reading, trying to lose myself in someone else's story, when I heard the sound of breaking glass. Following the noise, I found Dominic in the library's reading nook, a bottle of bourbon in one hand, crystal tumbler shards scattered at his feet. He looked broken. His shirt was open, revealing the hard planes of his chest, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were haunted, filled with a pain so raw it made my own grief seem small in comparison. "You want to know why your husband really died?" he said without looking up, his words slurred, but still carrying that dangerous edge. He found out what I am. I should have left. Should have backed away slowly and pretended I'd never seen him like this. Instead, I stepped closer, drawn by the broken sound of his voice. "Marcus didn't die in an accident, did he?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Accident, that's what we told everyone. Can't have the family name tarnished by suicide, can we?" The world tilted. Suicide? He found my journals, read about the others, about how I'd been watching you long before he ever laid eyes on you. Dominic finally looked at me then, and I saw the truth written in his expression. He couldn't live with what his father had become. I felt sick. "What are you talking about?" He stood abruptly, moving toward me with the fluid grace of a predator. Before I could retreat, he was pressing something into my palm, a letter. The paper creased and worn as if it had been read 1,000 times. I recognized Marcus's handwriting immediately. "Father's obsession with you isn't new. I've seen the photographs, the surveillance reports. You've been watching Elena for months before we met. I know what you made me do, how you orchestrated our meeting. I can't live knowing I was just another tool in your collection. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Maybe then you'll understand the cost of your desires. The letter fell from my numb fingers. The dates didn't make sense, I would realize later. Dominic had been watching me, ... before I ever met his son. You were supposed to be mine first, he said, his voice raw with pain and something darker. Suddenly, he was pinning me against the bookshelf, his body crushing mine, his breath hot against my face. I sent him to observe you, to report back. I never meant for him to fall in love. I never meant for you to love him back. I slapped him. The sound echoed in the library like a gunshot, and for a moment we both froze. Then he laughed, licking the blood from his split lip, and I saw madness dancing in his eyes. Do it again, he challenged, his voice a growl. Make me bleed for what I've done? I should have been horrified. Should have run screaming from the house and never looked back. But his pain mirrored mine too perfectly, and I found myself drowning in the twisted recognition of a kindred spirit. We were both destroyers, both responsible for Marcus's death. In our own way. I should have left, I tell myself now, but even as I remember that night, I know I was already lost. The grief, the guilt, the rage, it was all tangled up with a desire so fierce it felt like drowning. I spent the next 2 days in a haze, barely eating, barely sleeping. The weight of the truth pressed down on me like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. Marcus was dead because of me, because his father had wanted me, had used his own son as a pawn in some sick game of obsession. But there was something else growing inside me, something darker than grief. It was rage pure, crystalline fury that burned away everything else. Dominic had taken my husband, my peace, my innocence. He'd turned my love story into a lie, my marriage into a manipulation. I wanted him to pay. The grandfather clock in the main hall was striking midnight when I finally left my room. I'd spent hours in front of the mirror, applying makeup with shaking hands, choosing the silk robe that Marcus had bought me for our first anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me, using my dead husband's gift to seduce his father. But this wasn't seduction. This was war. I found myself standing at Dominic's bedroom door, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it through the wood. This wasn't desire, I told myself, my hand trembling on the door handle. It was vengeance, for my husband, for my mother, for every lie he'd ever told. The door opened before I could knock. Dominic stood there, bare-chested, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his fingers through it. His eyes widened when he saw me, taking in the silk robe, the careful makeup, the way I was trembling with rage and need. "Elena," he breathed, and I heard everything in that single word: want, regret, triumph. I let the robe slip from my shoulders, pooling at my feet like liquid moonlight. His eyes darkened as they traced over my body, and I felt powerful for the first time since Marcus died. Finally, he growled, and then his mouth was on mine. The kiss was brutal, all teeth and tongues and desperate need. He wasn't gentle tasting? Of bourbon and desperation, his hands rough on my skin as he lifted me, carrying me to the bed. And I didn't want him to be gentle. I wanted him to be as broken as I was, as desperate, as consumed by this twisted thing between us. My nails raked down his back as he pressed me into the mattress, and I felt him shudder against me. The wedding ring Marcus had placed on my finger caught the firelight, a reminder of everything we were destroying, everything we'd already lost. He wasn't gentle, I remember thinking as his mouth moved down my throat, marking me with bruises that would take weeks to fade, and I didn't want him to be. Dawn came too soon, filtering through the heavy curtains like an unwelcome judgment. I dressed in silence, hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. Dominic watched me from the bed, a cigarette between his fingers, his eyes unreadable. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where I'd spent so many afternoons thinking about Marcus, about the life we'd planned together. The roses were still overgrown, still catching on things that tried to pass. "Did you love him?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause. Then, I loved the idea of him. The heir I needed, the son who would carry on the family name. But Marcus was too soft, too human. He could never be what I needed him to be. And what about me? I turned to face him, my hand steady now. "What am I to you?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're everything I've been looking for. Strong enough to survive me, dark enough to understand me. You're the one who'll help me build something lasting." "Still wearing his ring?" he asked, nodding toward my left hand. I looked down at the simple gold band, remembering the day Marcus had slipped it onto my finger. The happiness I'd felt then seemed like a lifetime ago, like it had belonged to someone else entirely. Slowly, deliberately, I slipped the ring from my finger. Dominic's eyes followed the movement, his breath catching as I walked to the knitstand, where his whiskey glass sat half empty. The ring made a soft clink as it hit the bottom of the glass. "Now we're even," I said, my voice cold and final. Dominic's smirk faded. I watched as realization dawned in his eyes, the understanding that he'd been played just as surely as he'd played everyone else. I'd used him, taken what I needed, and now I was walking away. "The Valescu men always took what they wanted," I said, already moving toward the door. "But this time, I took him." I was in the hallway when I heard it, the soft click of metal against metal. I didn't turn around, didn't need to. I knew what that sound meant. The police found Dominic's body 3 hours later when the housekeeper arrived for her morning shift. Suicide, they said, just like his son. The grief of losing Marcus had finally become too much to bear. I played the part of the devastated daughter-in-law perfectly. Black dress, tears at the right moments, a trembling voice as I told them about his depression, his drinking, his guilt over Marcus's death. They believed every word. The will reading was a formality. As the last surviving member of the Valescu family, I inherited everything: the mansion, the fortune, the dark legacy that came with the name. I had the portraits in the West Wing destroyed, but I kept the journals. Evidence, I told myself, insurance. Some nights I walk through the empty halls and remember the weight of Dominic's hands on my skin, the sound of his voice in the darkness, the way he looked at me like I was salvation and damnation wrapped in silk. I tell myself it was justice, that I gave him exactly what he deserved. But in the quiet moments, when the mansion settles around me like a living thing, I wonder if I've become exactly what he always wanted me to be. The last Valescu, keeper of secrets, destroyer of men who dare to love me. The roses in the garden have finally been tended. They're beautiful now, but they still have thorns. And I'm still here, waiting in this house of secrets, wondering if the darkness I found in myself that night will ever let me go. They say grief changes you. What they don't tell you is that sometimes it reveals who you were meant to be all along. I am Elena Valescu now, and I am exactly where I belong.